When a young boy endures hidden abuse and neglect at the hands of his foster parents, they believe their cruelty will remain buried beneath their carefully crafted facade. But they're dead wrong. A determined teacher steps in, exposing their lies and deception. This is a story of resilience, courage, and the relentless pursuit of justice for a child who refuses to be silenced. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you stand for justice, be sure to like and subscribe for more. Ethan's pencil froze mid-doodle as the classroom door creaked open. All heads turned. Miss Hayes, the principal, stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. Ethan's stomach tightened. She rarely showed up unannounced, and when she did, it was never good news. "Ethan, I need to see you," she said, her voice calm but clipped. The room went silent. The other kids exchanged glances, a few smirks spreading across faces. Ethan's heart raced as he slid his notebook into his backpack. He avoided the stairs and shuffled past his classmates, each step feeling heavier than the last. His mind raced through everything he could have done wrong. Was it the forgotten homework? Did someone complain about him? Miss Hayes didn't say much as they walked down the hallway, her heels clicking sharply against the tile, each step echoing in the otherwise empty corridor. Ethan trailed behind, his palms damp. The principal's office door loomed ahead, its frosted glass catching the afternoon light. When Miss Hayes opened the door, Ethan hesitated on the threshold. His foster parents, Carl and Linda Miller, were sitting stiffly inside. Carl's hands rested on his knees, his jaw tight. Linda clutched her purse with both hands, her lips pressed into a strange smile. Ethan's pulse quickened. They never came to school. Why were they here? "Come in, Ethan," Miss Hayes said, motioning toward the empty chair beside Carl and Linda. He sat down slowly, his legs barely reaching the floor. The air in the room felt thick, suffocating. Miss Hayes closed the door and took her seat behind the desk, folding her hands neatly. She looked at Ethan with a practiced warmth, but there was something else in her gaze. Concern, maybe even suspicion. "Ethan, I wanted to speak with you because one of your teachers, Miss Roberts, has expressed some concerns about you." Ethan's chest tightened. Concerns? What kind of concerns? His eyes flicked to Carl, who was staring straight ahead, his expression carved in stone. Linda's fake smile remained, but her knuckles had gone white from gripping her purse. Ethan couldn't bring himself to meet Miss Hayes's gaze. She mentioned a few things. Some bruises, your withdrawn behavior. She's worried that you might be having a hard time at home. "Is there anything you'd like to tell me?" Miss Hayes's tone was soft, inviting, too inviting. Ethan's throat felt like sandpaper. He opened his mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Carl shifted in his chair, and Ethan caught the slight narrowing of his eyes, a warning. Linda reached out and rested a hand on Carl's arm. A small gesture, but one that screamed, "Stay in line." "I'm fine," Ethan finally croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. Miss Hayes tilted her head slightly, as if to encourage him. "Ethan, it's okay. If there's something wrong, you can tell me. We just want to make sure you're safe." Carl cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Miss Hayes, I understand your concern, but Ethan's been through a lot. Adjusting to a new home is always difficult, and we're doing everything we can to support him." Linda nodded quickly, her tone syrupy sweet. "Oh yes, Ethan's a wonderful boy, but he's still learning to trust us. These transitions can take time, can't they, sweetheart?" She turned to Ethan, her smile tightening. The word sweetheart felt like a knife in his chest. Ethan forced himself to nod, his hands clenched into fists in his lap. He didn't dare say otherwise. Miss Hayes glanced between them, her lips pressed into a thin line. "Ethan, do you feel safe at home?" Carl's jaw twitched. Ethan felt his gaze burn into the side of his face. He stared at the floor, his voice small. "Yes." The room fell silent. Miss Hayes leaned back in her chair, watching them closely. Finally, she exhaled and said, "All right. But Ethan, I want you to know that if you ever need to talk, my door is always open. Don't hesitate, okay?" Ethan nodded again, but the lump in his throat made it impossible to speak. As they left the office, Carl placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his grip firm. He leaned down, his voice low and cold. "We'll talk about this later," he muttered, his fingers digging into Ethan's shoulder like claws. That night, Ethan sat in his room, staring at the crack under his door where light spilled in from the hallway. He could hear Carl and Linda's voices drifting up from the kitchen, their argument loud and bitter. "You're spending too much, Carl. We're barely making ends meet," Linda snapped. "Oh, don't start with that again," Carl shot back, his voice dripping with irritation. "We're fine as long as we've got the boy. The stipends will keep coming. What's your problem?" "It's not about the money," Linda hissed. "It's about him. He's going to cause us trouble if we're not careful." "Did you see the way that principal was looking at us?" Carl let out a sharp laugh. "Let them look. No one's going to believe some foster kid over us. We're the perfect family, remember?" Ethan's hands trembled as he clutched the photo of his biological family he kept hidden under his mattress. It was faded, the edges torn, but it was the only thing he had left of his real home. He stared at his mother's smiling face, at the strong hand of his father holding him as a baby. "I miss you," he whispered, tears stinging his eyes. He let himself wonder, was staying silent really the safest choice? The bell rang, marking the start of a new school day, but Miss Roberts couldn't shake the unease from the day before. The brief meeting in the principal's office lingered in her mind, the tension in Ethan's shoulders, the way his foster parents had expertly deflected every concern. It hadn't sat right with her then, and it still didn't now. Ethan arrived late to class that morning, quietly slipping into his seat in the back. His hair was unkempt, and his shirt looked slightly wrinkled, as though he'd thrown it on in a rush. Miss Roberts noticed the dark circles under his eyes. He didn't look up as she began the lesson. "All right, let's pick up where we left off yesterday," she said, walking around the room as the students worked. Miss Roberts glanced at Ethan. His pencil moved slowly across the paper, his gaze fixed downward. Something was off. She could feel it. When the students were dismissed for recess, Miss Roberts called Ethan over. "Hey, Ethan, can you stay back for a minute? I need to talk to you." He hesitated, then nodded and shuffled to her desk, standing awkwardly, fidgeting with the strap of his backpack. "How are you doing today?" she asked, her tone light but genuine. Fine," he said quickly, too quickly. Miss Roberts folded her hands on the desk, softening her voice. "Ethan, if there's anything bothering you, you know you can talk to me, right? I'm here to help." He nodded again, but his silence spoke volumes. His eyes darted toward the door, as if calculating how quickly he could leave. Miss Roberts decided not to push him further. "All right, you can head to recess," she said, offering a small smile. "But remember, my door is always open." "Thanks," he mumbled, hurrying out of the room. That afternoon, Miss Roberts sat in the teacher lounge during lunch, her notebook open in front of her. She had started jotting down observations about Ethan, piecing together the small details that had unsettled her. She listed the things she had noticed over the past few months: his reluctance to participate in class activities, his habit of sitting alone during group work, and the worn-out clothes he often wore. Then there were the times he had come to school late or seemed exhausted, and the troubling comment he had made once about his parents not liking to waste money on food. "Ethan's been on your mind a lot lately, hasn't he?" asked Mrs. Alvarez, a colleague who taught math, as she sipped her coffee. Miss Roberts hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I feel like something's not right. Have you noticed anything?" Mrs. Alvarez leaned back in her chair, thinking. "He's always so quiet in my class. Doesn't really speak up unless I call on him. I've noticed he looks a little tired sometimes, but I figured it was just normal middle school stuff." "What about breakfast?" Miss Roberts pressed. "Has he ever come to your first period class hungry?" Mrs. Alvarez frowned. "Now that you mention it, yes, there have been a few mornings when he seemed out of it. He doesn't eat breakfast in the cafeteria either. He just sits there during free period." Miss Roberts made a note in her notebook, her gut telling her she was on the right track. "Thanks, Mrs. Alvarez. That helps." As the lunch period ended, Miss Roberts resolved to keep a closer eye on Ethan. But she knew she'd need more than just observations to take action. At dismissal that day, Miss Roberts stayed near the front entrance, watching the students leave. She spotted Ethan standing near the gate, his backpack slung low over one shoulder, his posture slouched, his gaze fixed on the ground. A moment later, a sleek black sedan pulled up, and Carl stepped out, dressed sharply in a button-down shirt and slacks, his polished shoes catching the light. "Hey there, champ," Carl called out, his voice warm and cheerful. Ethan flinched slightly but walked over to the car without a word. Miss Roberts noticed how he kept his head down, avoiding Carl's gaze. As Carl placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, something about the gesture seemed off. Too firm, too controlling. Miss Roberts's eyes narrowed. Carl's demeanor felt overly rehearsed, as though he was performing for anyone who might be watching. Ethan climbed into the passenger seat, and Carl gave a quick glance around before getting in himself. The car pulled away, leaving Miss Roberts standing there, her unease growing. That evening, back in her quiet apartment, Miss Roberts sat at her desk with her notebook open again. She wrote down everything she had seen that day: Ethan's late arrival, his withdrawn behavior, and the interaction with Carl at dismissal. Her pen hovered for a moment before she wrote. Ethan avoided looking at Carl. Tense body language. Carl's tone felt performative. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the notes. It was a lot of small pieces, but together they painted a troubling picture. She thought about going straight to the school counselor with what she had, but she knew that without concrete evidence, Carl and Linda would likely talk their way out of it again. Their charm and polished facade were hard to break through. Her thoughts wandered to Ethan, and a pang of guilt hit her. If she waited too long to act, what might happen to him? But if she acted without enough proof, would anyone believe her? Or worse, would it make things harder for him? Miss Roberts sighed and closed the notebook, her resolve firming. Tomorrow she would start paying even closer attention. She couldn't let this go unnoticed any longer. Do you think Ethan should speak out about his foster parents' neglect and abuse? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Will anyone believe him? Or will Carl and Linda's lies keep the truth buried? Don't forget to like this video if you're eager to find out, and stay tuned to see if Miss Roberts can uncover the truth before it's too late. Ethan sat at his usual spot near the corner of the room, away from the commotion, nibbling on a plain sandwich he'd hastily packed that morning. The cafeteria was buzzing with the usual midday chaos. Students laughing, trays clattering, conversations overlapping into a dull roar. His math homework lay open beside him, the pencil resting lightly in his hand. He wasn't really working on it, though. He was just trying to look busy. "Mind if I sit here?" The voice startled him. Ethan glanced up to see a boy around his age, standing across the table. He had an easy smile and a sharpness in his eyes that gave off a mix of confidence and mischief. Ethan shrugged, lowering his gaze back to his homework. "Sure." The boy plopped his tray onto the table, sitting down with an exaggerated sigh. "Man, this school is wild. I've only been here 2 days, and I've already seen 3 fights and 1 kid fall asleep during gym. You guys don't mess around, huh?" Ethan didn't respond, unsure of what to say. "I'm Noah, by the way," the boy continued, unfazed by Ethan's silence. He took a bite of his pizza and gestured toward Ethan's homework. "You're working on math during lunch? You're making the rest of us look bad, man." Ethan finally allowed a small smile to creep onto his face, though he didn't look up. "It's due next period." "Fair enough," Noah said, leaning back in his chair. "So, you always sit alone, or am I just interrupting YY time?" Ethan hesitated, then shrugged. "I just like the quiet." Noah nodded thoughtfully, as if filing that piece of information away. "Cool. Quiet's good." He paused for a moment before adding, "I'm new here, so I'm still figuring out who's who. You seem chill, though. Mind if I eat lunch here again tomorrow?" Ethan blinked, caught off guard by the question. Most people didn't ask. They either ignored him completely or made him the butt of some joke. Sure," he mumbled. "Sweet," Noah said, grinning. "Looks like I found my lunch buddy." Over the next few days, Noah stuck to his word, showing up at Ethan's table every lunch period. chatting away about everything and nothing. Ethan didn't say much, but Noah didn't seem to mind. He filled the silences with stories about his old school, his favorite movies, and his general dislike for cafeteria food. One day during gym class, they were paired together for a basketball drill. Ethan moved clumsily on the court, clearly uncomfortable, while Noah bounced the ball effortlessly between his hands. At one point, Noah reached out to pass the ball to Ethan, and his gaze landed on Ethan's wrist. "Hey," Noah said, frowning. "What happened there?" Ethan glanced down, realizing too late that his sleeve had ridden up, exposing a faint purple bruise just above his wrist. He quickly tugged the fabric down, shaking his head. "Nothing. I just banged it on something." Noah raised an eyebrow, his expression skeptical. "Aha. Sure it's nothing." "It is," Ethan insisted, turning away and grabbing the ball. Noah didn't press further, but his curiosity was piqued. He'd seen that look before, the quick deflection, the unwillingness to talk about it. It reminded him of kids he'd known in his previous foster homes, kids who carried secrets they were too scared to share. Later that afternoon, the two of them walked home together, the sun low in the sky, casting long shadows across the sidewalk. Noah tossed his backpack over one shoulder, keeping pace with Ethan. "So, you're not really a talker, huh?" Noah said after a while. Ethan shrugged. "I just don't have much to say." Noah smirked. "That's cool. I talk enough for both of us anyway." They walked in silence for a few minutes before Noah spoke again, his tone more serious. "You know, I used to be in foster care, too." Ethan glanced at him, surprised. "Yeah," Noah said, kicking a loose pebble down the sidewalk. "I've had my share of bad homes. Not all of them, but a couple. There was this one family. They were all smiles in public, but behind closed doors, total nightmare." Ethan kept his eyes forward, but his grip on his backpack straps tightened. "I didn't think anyone would believe me," Noah continued. "I mean, who's gonna listen to some foster kid, right? That's what I told myself. But then one of my teachers noticed something was up, kind of like your Miss Roberts. She talked to me and I finally told her everything. Scared the hell out of me, but it was the best thing I ever did." Ethan didn't respond, but Noah could tell he was listening. "Look, I'm not saying your situation is the same," Noah added quickly. "I'm just saying there are people who care. Teachers, social workers, friends. You don't have to keep everything to yourself, you know?" Ethan's jaw clenched, and he shook his head. "You don't get it. Carl and Linda. They're good at making people believe what they want them to believe. No one's going to take my side." "I do get it," Noah said. "I've been there. But you're not alone in this. If you need someone to talk to, I'm here. Okay? And if you ever want to tell Miss Roberts or someone else, I'll back you up." Ethan hesitated, fear and doubt warring inside him. The idea of speaking up still terrified him. "For now," he said quietly, I'm not ready." Noah nodded. "That's okay. I'll be here when you are." For the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt a small glimmer of hope flicker inside him. That evening, Ethan sat on his bed, replaying Noah's words in his head. He reached for the photo of his biological family under his pillow, running his fingers over the worn edges. Maybe Noah was right. Maybe there were people who cared. But the idea of speaking up still terrified him. For now, he decided he'd take it one day at a time. At least he had someone in his corner. The dinner table was quiet that evening, apart from the soft clinking of silverware against plates. Ethan sat in his usual spot, keeping his head down, cautiously eating the overcooked chicken Linda had made. Carl sat at the head of the table, scrolling through his phone, barely paying attention to anyone. Linda was fussing over the state of the house, muttering to herself about needing to clean up after dinner. "Ethan, when you're done eating, I want you to clear the table and wipe down the counters," Linda said curtly, her tone sharp and businesslike. "Yes, ma'am," Ethan replied quietly, barely lifting his head. As soon as the plates were cleared, Linda and Carl moved to the living room, leaving Ethan alone in the kitchen. He carefully stacked the dishes in the sink, taking extra care not to make a sound. His hands moved with practiced precision, scrubbing and rinsing, while his mind wandered to Noah's words from earlier that day. There are people who care. You don't have to keep everything to yourself. The thought felt distant, almost impossible. He reached for the cloth to wipe down the counter, but his elbow accidentally bumped into a small vase perched precariously on the edge. The sound of shattering ceramic filled the room. Ethan froze, his stomach dropping as he stared at the broken pieces scattered on the floor. What was that? Carl's voice boomed from the living room. Ethan scrambled to pick up the pieces, his hands trembling. Before he could gather them, Carl stormed into the kitchen, followed closely by Linda. Carl's face darkened the moment he saw the mess. Are you kidding me? Carl barked, his voice echoing off the walls. Do you have any idea how much that vase cost? I'm sorry, Ethan stammered, his voice barely audible. He kept his eyes on the floor, his hands clutching the larger pieces of the shattered vase. Sorry doesn't fix it, does it? Carl yelled, his anger boiling over. You're nothing but a clumsy, useless. Carl, Linda interrupted, stepping forward with her hands raised. It's just a vase. Let it go. Let it go. Carl snapped, turning to her. Do you realize the stress I'm under? And now this little brat can't even manage basic chores without screwing up. Linda hesitated, glancing at Ethan for a brief moment. It looked like she might defend him, but then her expression hardened. Ethan, you need to be more careful. We don't have time for your mistakes. Ethan opened his mouth to apologize again, but before he could speak, Carl grabbed his arm, yanking him upright. The sharp grip sent a jolt of pain up Ethan's arm, and he winced. You better shape up, boy, Carl growled, his face inches from Ethan's. Because if you mess up like this again, there will be real consequences. Do you hear me? Ethan nodded quickly, his heart pounding. Carl released him with a shove, and Ethan stumbled back, clutching his arm. Without another word, Carl turned and stormed out of the kitchen, Linda following close behind. Ethan retreated to his room, closing the door quietly behind him. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the faint red mark Carl's hand had left on his arm. His chest tightened, and the tears he'd been holding back all evening finally spilled over. He reached under his pillow and pulled out the torn photo of his biological family, the edges frayed and a small rip running through the middle. It was still the most precious thing he owned. He traced his finger over his mother's smiling face, then his father's strong, reassuring presence in the background. Why can't I just be with you? He whispered, his voice cracking. The tears came harder now, his body trembling with the weight of it all. As the night wore on, Ethan lay on his bed, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced, replaying the scene in the kitchen over and over. Just as he was beginning to drift off, faint voices from the living room caught his attention. He sat up, his heart pounding, as he quietly crept to his door, pressing his ear against it. Carl's voice was low but filled with smugness. Yeah, it's easy money. You just play the part, keep the kid in line, and the checks keep rolling in. It's not rocket science. Ethan's blood ran cold. He could hear Linda chime in, her voice quieter. We can't have another visit from the school. You need to make sure he keeps his mouth shut. Ethan backed away from the door, his breathing uneven. He crawled back into bed, pulling the blanket tightly around him. The words echoed in his head, louder than anything else. No one will believe a foster kid. The next morning, Ethan arrived at school, his body heavy with exhaustion. He barely made it through his classes, his mind consumed by the events of the night before. When the lunch bell rang, he found Noah waiting for him at their usual spot in the cafeteria. Hey, Noah said, his grin fading the moment he saw Ethan's face. You okay? Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. No, I'm not. Noah's brows furrowed. What happened? Ethan glanced around, making sure no one else was listening. He lowered his voice. Last night, Carl got mad. He grabbed me, yelled at me, and then I heard him talking to Linda about how they're just using me for money. They don't care about me. His voice broke, and he looked away. Noah's jaw tightened, his usual lightheartedness replaced by a fierce determination. Ethan, you have to tell someone. Miss Roberts, the school counselor, anyone. You can't keep this to yourself. Ethan shook his head quickly. I can't. They'll just lie their way out of it. Carl said no one would believe me. That's bull, Noah said firmly. Miss Roberts already knows something's up. You tell her what you just told me, and she'll do something about it. Ethan hesitated, fear and doubt warring inside him. What if it just makes everything worse? It won't, Noah said, his voice steady, but staying quiet will. You deserve better than this, Ethan. Ethan stared at the table, his eyes stinging. Noah's words sank in, and after a long pause, he gave a small nod. Okay, I'll talk to her. Noah smiled, clapping him on the shoulder. You're doing the right thing, man. I'll be here no matter what. That afternoon, Ethan walked to Miss Roberts's classroom, his heart pounding. He didn't know what would happen next, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stay silent anymore. The school hallways were nearly empty, echoing with the faint sounds of distant conversations. As Ethan walked toward Miss Roberts's classroom, his palms were sweaty, his heart pounding with each step. He clutched his backpack tightly, his thoughts racing. Doubts clouded his mind. What if she doesn't believe me? What if this makes everything worse? When he reached her door, he hesitated. Inside, Miss Roberts was sitting at her desk, sorting through a stack of papers. She looked calm, focused, completely unaware of the storm raging inside Ethan. Gathering every ounce of courage he could muster, he knocked lightly on the doorframe. Miss Roberts looked up and smiled gently. Ethan, come in. What's on your mind? Ethan stepped inside, his movements stiff and uncertain. He glanced around the room, as if checking to make sure they were alone, then shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I need to talk to you, he said, his voice barely audible. Miss Roberts sat down across from him, her hands twisting the strap of his backpack. For a moment, he couldn't bring himself to speak. The words were trapped in his throat, weighed down by fear. It's okay, Miss Roberts said softly, leaning forward slightly. You can take your time. Whatever it is, I'm here to listen. Ethan nodded, swallowing hard. It's about Carl and Linda, he began, his voice shaky. They're not who they seem to be. At home, it's not like how they act here. Miss Roberts tilted her head, her expression encouraging but concerned. What do you mean? They're different when no one's around, Ethan said, his words tumbling out in a rush. They yell a lot. Carl, he grabbed my arm last night because I broke something, and he said if I mess up again, there'll be real consequences. He paused, his breath hitching. Miss Roberts waited patiently, letting him gather his thoughts. They're always so nice when people are watching, Ethan continued, but when we're at home, it's like they don't care. Carl just talks about money all the time, and last night I heard him on the phone, laughing about how easy it is to get foster care money. He said no one would believe a kid like me. Miss Roberts's face softened, her concern deepening. Ethan, I'm so sorry you've been dealing with this, she said gently. You don't deserve to be treated that way. Ethan hesitated, then pushed up his sleeve, revealing the faint red mark Carl had left on his arm. This is from last night, he said quietly. Miss Roberts's expression darkened. Does this happen often? He nodded reluctantly. Sometimes. Not always like this, but they're always yelling, always blaming me for stuff. And they make me feel like I'm nothing. Miss Roberts took a deep breath, trying to keep her own emotions in check. Ethan, thank you for telling me this. I know it wasn't easy, but I'm glad you trusted me enough to share. Ethan looked down, his hands twisting the strap of his backpack again. I don't have any proof, though, he muttered. Just what I remember and what I heard. Miss Roberts leaned forward. Your words matter, Ethan. What you've told me is important, and I'm going to make sure this is taken seriously. You don't have to do this alone. Okay? Ethan's shoulders sagged slightly, some of the tension easing from his body. Okay, he whispered. The next morning, Miss Roberts went straight to the school counselor, sharing everything Ethan had told her. The counselor immediately contacted Ethan's caseworker, scheduling a home visit for later that afternoon. Miss Roberts hoped this would finally be the start of change for Ethan, but she couldn't shake the worry gnawing at her. By the time the caseworker arrived at Carl and Linda's house, The couple was ready. The living room was spotless, every surface gleaming, and Ethan sat on the couch, his face carefully blank. Carl greeted the caseworker with a warm smile, shaking her hand firmly. "Thank you for coming," Carl said, his voice dripping with sincerity. "We've been so worried about Ethan. He's been having a hard time adjusting, but we're doing our best to support him." Linda chimed in, her tone saccharine sweet. "Oh yes, Ethan's a wonderful boy, but he's been through so much. It breaks my heart to see him struggle." The caseworker asked a few questions, but Carl and Linda deflected each one with ease, painting a picture of themselves as patient, devoted foster parents. When the caseworker turned to Ethan and asked if he felt safe at home, Carl's eyes flicked toward him, a subtle but unmistakable warning. "Yes," Ethan said quietly, his hands gripping the couch cushions. The caseworker nodded, making a few notes in her file. She stayed for another 15 minutes before thanking Carl and Linda for their time and leaving. As soon as the door closed, Carl's smile vanished. He turned to Ethan, his face hard and cold. "What did you tell her?" "Nothing," Ethan said quickly. "I didn't say anything." "You better not have," Carl growled. "You think you're smart, trying to make us look bad? You're lucky we even let you stay here. You're nothing without us. Do you understand?" Ethan nodded, his chest tightening. He fled to his room, closing the door behind him. His hands shook as he sat on his bed, staring at the floor. The next day, Miss Roberts noticed Ethan's pale face and downcast eyes during lunch. She pulled him aside. "How did the visit go?" she asked gently. Ethan hesitated, then whispered, "They didn't believe me." Carl and Linda made it look like everything was fine. Miss Roberts's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Ethan, don't let this discourage you. The truth has a way of coming out, and I'm not giving up on you. We'll figure this out together." Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, Miss Roberts's reassurance was enough to keep him going. The atmosphere in Carl and Linda's house shifted the day after the caseworker visit. Ethan could feel it as soon as he woke up. The usual sharp commands and passive-aggressive remarks were replaced by an eerie quietness, almost as if they were waiting for something to happen. Downstairs, Carl and Linda sat at the dining table, speaking in low voices. Ethan hesitated at the top of the stairs, catching snippets of their conversation. "They're watching us now," Linda muttered, her tone tense. "We can't have another visit like that. That boy is going to ruin everything." "Let them watch," Carl said, his voice colder, more calculating. "We'll handle this like we always do. Control the narrative. I've already made a call to the lawyer. He's drafting a letter to the caseworker, framing this as a classic case of a troubled kid acting out. Emotional instability, behavioral issues, you name it. It'll discredit anything he tries to say." Ethan's heart sank. He quietly stepped back into his room, closing the door. He knew they were already spinning their web, turning him into the villain before he even had a chance to speak. Over the next few days, Carl and Linda went into full damage control mode. Carl spent hours on the phone, contacting neighbors, church members, and anyone else in the community who might vouch for them. He painted a picture of a loving couple taking in a difficult foster child, emphasizing their patience and generosity. "Ethan's been through a lot," Carl would say, his voice dripping with faux concern. "We're doing everything we can for him, but he's struggling. We just want to make sure he gets the help he needs." Linda, meanwhile, played her part perfectly in public. She became overly affectionate toward Ethan, patting his shoulder and calling him sweetheart whenever they were around other people. At school drop-offs, she smiled warmly at teachers and even brought cookies to Ethan's class, earning praise from staff and parents alike. But behind closed doors, their true colors showed. Carl's cold demeanor became even harsher, and Linda's sugary sweetness turned to icy indifference. They revoked Ethan's privileges, taking away his access to TV and limiting his meals to the bare minimum. He wasn't allowed to leave his room unless it was for school or chores. They even began monitoring his every move, checking his backpack and pockets when he came home and confiscating anything they deemed suspicious. One evening, Carl barged into Ethan's room unannounced, rummaging through his drawers and closet. "What are you doing?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling. "Making sure you're not hiding anything," Carl snapped, throwing clothes onto the floor as he searched. When he found nothing, he left with a warning. "Don't even think about trying to pull something stupid." "Well, no." Ethan sat on his bed, staring at the mess Carl had left behind. The walls of his small room felt like they were closing in, suffocating him. He clutched the torn photo of his biological family, the only thing they hadn't found yet, and wondered how much longer he could endure this. The manipulation extended beyond the house. Carl tracked down Noah's parents, showing up at their door one evening. Ethan didn't know what was said, but the next day Noah told him about the encounter during lunch. "My dad said Carl came over last night," Noah said, frowning. "He told my parents you're making stuff up and that you're a troublemaker. He said you've been lying about them and trying to cause problems." Ethan's stomach dropped. "What did your parents say?" "They don't believe him," Noah said firmly. "I told them what I've seen, and they're on your side. But, Ethan, you have to be careful. Carl's trying to isolate you. He doesn't want anyone helping you." Ethan nodded, his throat tightening. "I already feel isolated," he admitted. "Every time I try to fight back, they just make things worse." Noah placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "That's what they want. They're trying to scare you into silence. But you can't let them win. Miss Roberts is still fighting for you, right?" Ethan nodded again, but his confidence was shaky. What if it's not enough? What if no one believes her either? "They will," Noah said, his voice steady, "but you have to hang in there. You're not alone in this." Despite Noah's reassurance, the psychological toll on Ethan deepened. Each day at school felt like a brief escape, but the moment he stepped back into Carl and Linda's house, the weight returned. He became quieter, more withdrawn, retreating further into himself. Miss Roberts noticed the change immediately. She pulled Ethan aside after class one day, her concern evident. "Ethan, you seem different lately. Is everything okay?" Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. "They're watching me," he whispered. "They're trying to make me look like a liar." Miss Roberts's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice calm. "I know it feels that way, Ethan, but the truth has a way of coming out. You've already taken the hardest step by speaking up. Don't lose hope, okay?" Ethan looked at her, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and hope. He didn't know what the future held, but Miss Roberts's reassurance was enough to keep him going. The idea started as a small spark, ignited by Miss Roberts's and Noah's unwavering support. Ethan couldn't rely on his words alone. Carl and Linda were too good at twisting the truth. If he wanted to expose them, he needed proof, real, undeniable proof. Sitting in the quiet of Miss Roberts's classroom after school one day, Ethan finally voiced his plan. "I need to show people what they're really like," he said, his voice hesitant but determined. "If I don't, no one will believe me." Miss Roberts leaned forward, her eyes filled with concern. "That's a big step, Ethan. It's risky, but if you're careful, it could make a difference. Are you sure you're ready for this?" Ethan nodded, though his stomach twisted with nerves. "I have to try." The first step was figuring out how to gather the evidence. Ethan dug out his old phone, the one Carl had taken away months ago, and hid it in the bottom of his closet. It was a little outdated, but the camera still worked, and the microphone was sensitive enough to pick up sound from across the room. He decided to start small, recording Carl's outbursts when he thought no one was watching. That night, after dinner, Ethan positioned the phone on a shelf in his room, partially hidden behind a stack of books. He didn't have to wait long. As he sat on his bed pretending to do homework, Carl barged in, his face twisted with frustration. "Why are the dishes still in the sink, Ethan?" Carl demanded, his voice booming. "I told you to clean them after dinner." "I was about to do them," Ethan stammered, his hands trembling. Carl took a step closer, his voice dropping into a cold, threatening tone. "Don't give me excuses, boy. You think you can just slack off and do whatever you want? Not in this house." Ethan nodded quickly, keeping his head down while the phone silently recorded every word. Over the next few days, Ethan became more confident in his efforts. He began taking photos of the bruises on his arms, carefully documenting the evidence before the marks faded. Each time, he made sure to hide the phone securely, knowing that if Carl or Linda found it, everything would fall apart. Noah was his partner in this covert operation. The two of them would meet during lunch, huddling in a quiet corner of the schoolyard to discuss their progress. "How's it going?" Noah asked one afternoon, his voice low. "I've got a few recordings and some pictures," Ethan said, glancing around to make sure no one was listening. "But it's not enough. I need something bigger." Noah nodded thoughtfully. "What about their finances? Didn't you say Carl talks about money all the time?" Ethan frowned, the idea taking shape in his mind. "He has an office at home where he keeps all his paperwork. Maybe I could look there." "That could work," Noah said, "but be careful. If they catch you, they won't." Ethan interrupted, more to convince himself than Noah. "I'll be careful." That evening, while Linda was cooking dinner and Carl was in the living room watching TV, Ethan slipped into Carl's office. The room smelled faintly of old coffee and leather, and the desk was cluttered with papers and receipts. Ethan's heart pounded as he sifted through the mess, scanning for anything that looked important. After a few minutes, he found what he was looking for: a folder labeled Finances. He opened it and froze. Inside were bank statements and invoices detailing how Carl and Linda had been using their foster care stipends. Luxury clothing, expensive dinners, and even a recent weekend getaway, all paid for with money meant to care for Ethan. Ethan quickly pulled out his phone and began snapping photos of the documents, his hands shaking. Just as he finished, he heard footsteps approaching the office. His breath caught in his throat. Carl's voice was getting louder, the sound of his boots growing closer. Panicking, Ethan shoved the folder back into the drawer and slid under the desk, clutching his phone tightly. The door creaked open, and Carl stepped inside, muttering to himself as he grabbed a pen from the desk. He lingered for a moment, glancing around the room, before finally leaving. Ethan waited until the footsteps faded completely before crawling out from under the desk, his legs trembling as he slipped out of the office and back to his room. He couldn't believe how close he'd come to being caught. The next day at school, Ethan shared the photos with Miss Roberts. She studied them carefully, her expression grave. "This is good, Ethan. This is exactly the kind of proof we need. But it's still risky. Are you okay?" Ethan nodded, though he looked exhausted. "I'm fine, just tired." Miss Roberts gave him a small smile. "You're doing an incredible job. I'll take these to the school counselor and add them to the report." Meanwhile, Miss Roberts continued gathering evidence on her end. She interviewed Noah, who recounted the times he had witnessed Carl's aggressive behavior. She also spoke to other teachers, documenting their observations about Ethan's withdrawn demeanor and the bruises they'd noticed. Slowly but surely, a fuller picture of Carl and Linda's behavior began to take shape. Back at home, however, Carl was growing suspicious. He started checking Ethan's room more frequently, searching for anything that might incriminate him. One evening, he found Ethan's backpack lying open on the floor and rifled through it, coming up empty. Still, his paranoia grew. "You've been acting weird lately," Carl said over dinner one night, his eyes narrowing at Ethan. "If you're up to something, you'd better stop." "I'm not playing games." Ethan kept his head down, silently eating his meal. He could feel Linda's gaze on him as well, her smile faint but menacing. The constant surveillance and hostility at home took a toll on Ethan. He began to second-guess himself, wondering if all his efforts would even make a difference. But every time he felt like giving up, he thought of Noah and Miss Roberts, their unwavering belief in him keeping him going. One afternoon, as Ethan and Noah sat in the schoolyard, Noah gave him a firm pat on the shoulder. "You're doing great, man. They're scared, and that's a good thing. It means they know you're on to them." Ethan gave a small nod, though his chest felt heavy. "I just want this to be over." "It will be," Noah said confidently, "soon." Together, Ethan and Miss Roberts prepared their findings, knowing they were walking a dangerous line. The hostility from Carl and Linda was growing, but so was the strength of their case. They weren't just building evidence, they were building hope. Chunk 3 of 3, 7,500 characters. The tension in Ethan's life reached a boiling point after weeks of gathering evidence. The photos of bruises, the recordings of Carl's verbal outbursts, and the financial documents that Miss Roberts had compiled with Ethan's help painted a damning picture of Carl and Linda's neglect and manipulation. Miss Roberts had taken everything to the school counselor, who promptly escalated the matter to Ethan's caseworker. Unlike before, this time the evidence couldn't be ignored. Ethan's caseworker, accompanied by a legal representative from the Child Welfare Agency, scheduled an emergency meeting with Carl and Linda. The meeting was tense, with Carl playing the role of the victimized parent, decrying Ethan's ungratefulness and emotional instability. Linda chimed in, feigning tears and claiming they had done everything possible to help Ethan adjust. But the evidence was irrefutable. The caseworker, flipping through the financial documents and listening to excerpts of the recordings, began to piece together the true nature of the household. When pressed, Carl's facade began to crack, his answers growing defensive and angry. Linda's performance, too, faltered under scrutiny. The result of the meeting was swift and decisive. The agency decided to pursue an emergency custody hearing to determine Ethan's placement. The caseworker informed Carl and Linda that their status as foster parents was under review and that the court would decide Ethan's future. When Ethan heard the news, his emotions were mixed. Relief at the prospect of escaping Carl, and Linda clashed with the fear of facing them in court. Miss Roberts reassured him that she would be by his side, as would Noah, who promised to testify about what he had seen. With the date of the hearing set, Ethan braced himself for the next fight in his journey toward freedom. The courtroom was uncomfortably quiet as Ethan sat in a hard wooden chair near the front, his legs barely brushing the floor. He shifted nervously, tugging at the sleeves of his ill-fitting sweater. The tall ceiling, the polished benches, and the solemn faces of the judge and attorneys made the room feel impossibly large. Beside him sat Miss Roberts, her hand resting gently on his shoulder, and on the other side, Noah gave him an encouraging nod. Carl and Linda were seated across the room, impeccably dressed and oozing false sincerity. Their lawyer, a sharply dressed man with a slick demeanor, was already making his opening statement. My clients, Carl and Linda Miller, have gone above and beyond to provide a stable, loving home for Ethan, the lawyer began, gesturing toward them. Raising a foster child, especially one with a troubled past, is no easy task. Yet they've met every challenge with patience and kindness. Ethan gripped the edge of his chair, his stomach churning as Carl offered the judge a humble, almost saintly smile. Linda stabbed at her eyes with a tissue, perfectly playing the part of a heartbroken mother. The lawyer continued, unfortunately, children who have experienced trauma can sometimes act out. And in this case, Ethan has misinterpreted strict discipline as something far worse. My clients have done nothing but love and support him. Ethan's heart sank. The judge, a stern-looking woman with sharp features and kind eyes, nodded thoughtfully, her expression unreadable. Carl took the stand next, adjusting his tie and clearing his throat as if preparing for a performance. He looked straight at the judge, his voice cracking as he began to speak. Your Honor, taking Ethan into our home was the best decision we ever made, Carl said, his tone heavy with practiced emotion. He's been through so much, and we've tried to give him the stability he needs, but it hasn't been easy. He struggles with trust, and sometimes that comes out as defiance. He paused, glancing at the courtroom with watery eyes. We've sacrificed so much for him, our time, our resources, because we love him, and it hurts to think he might not feel the same. Ethan's fists clenched under the table. He wanted to scream that it was all a lie, but fear kept his voice locked inside. Carl's lawyer smiled smugly, clearly pleased with the performance. Linda took the stand next, her voice trembling as she spoke. Ethan is like a son to us, she said, her hands clutching the tissue as if it were a lifeline. We've done everything we can to make him feel at home, but it's been hard to break through his walls. All we want is what's best for him. The judge nodded again, her pen moving across a notepad. Ethan felt like the walls were closing in. They were so convincing, so polished. How could he ever make anyone believe the truth? Finally, it was Ethan's turn. His name was called, and Miss Roberts gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "You've got this," she whispered. Ethan rose slowly, his legs trembling as he walked to the stand. He climbed onto the chair, his small frame dwarfed by the imposing witness box. He glanced at the judge, then at Carl and Linda, who were staring at him with cold, expectant expressions. The judge's voice was gentle but firm. "Ethan, take your time. There's no rush." Ethan nodded, but his throat felt dry and the words stuck. He glanced toward the seats where Miss Roberts and Noah sat. Miss Roberts gave him an encouraging nod, and Noah mouthed, "You can do it." Taking a deep breath, Ethan began. "They're lying," he said, his voice trembling but clear. "They don't care about me, not really. At home, it's not like how they act here." Carl immediately leaned forward in his seat. "That's not true, Mr. Miller," the judge interrupted sharply, raising a hand. "You will remain silent while the witness speaks." Carl sat back, his jaw tight, but the glare he shot Ethan sent a chill down the boy's spine. "They yell at me all the time," Ethan continued, his voice wavering. "They say I'm worthless, and that I'm lucky to be with them." Carl grabbed my arm when he got mad. "He left a mark." Ethan pushed up his sleeve to show the faint bruise. And they only care about the money they get for taking care of me." I heard Carl say it on the phone. He laughed about it. The courtroom grew quieter with each word Ethan spoke. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his old phone, which Miss Roberts had helped him prepare as evidence. His hands shook as he passed it to the bailiff. "There are recordings on there," Ethan said, "of them yelling. And I took pictures of the bruises and the papers I found in Carl's office. They've been spending the foster care money on themselves." The bailiff handed the phone to the judge, who listened to one of the recordings through headphones. Her expression darkened. The room was silent, except for the faint sound of Carl's voice captured in one of his tirades. When the judge finally removed the headphones, her gaze was steely. Next, Noah took the stand. He sat confidently, his sharp eyes scanning the courtroom before he began. "I've seen how Carl treats Ethan," Noah said. "He's rough and he talks to him like he's nothing. One time, I saw him grab Ethan's arm and drag him into the car. Ethan looked scared, but Carl acted like nothing happened. And Ethan told me how they only act nice when someone's watching." The judge nodded, making more notes. Noah glanced at Ethan and gave him a small, reassuring smile as he stepped down from the stand. Finally, Miss Roberts presented her findings. She spoke with clarity and conviction, detailing the bruises she had noticed on Ethan, his withdrawn behavior, and the financial discrepancies she had helped uncover. She handed the judge a thick report filled with her documentation, including statements from other teachers. "Ethan has shown incredible courage coming forward," Miss Roberts said, "but he shouldn't have had to. The evidence speaks for itself. Carl and Linda have failed to provide a safe, supportive environment for this child." The judge leaned back in her chair, her face serious as she scanned the evidence. "We'll take a short recess to deliberate," she announced, standing and leaving the room. Ethan slumped back into his chair, exhaustion washing over him. Miss Roberts and Noah sat beside him, offering quiet reassurances. "You did it," Noah said, his voice full of pride. "You told the truth. That's what matters." Ethan nodded, though his hands still trembled. The waiting was the hardest part, but he knew he had done everything he could. Now it was up to the court to decide his fate. The courtroom fell silent as the judge returned, her expression firm and unreadable. Ethan's hands gripped the edge of the table, his heart pounding in his chest. Miss Roberts sat beside him, her presence steady and reassuring, while Noah gave him a small nod of encouragement. Across the room, Carl sat rigid, his jaw clenched, and Linda dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, her face a portrait of exaggerated grief. The judge cleared her throat, and all eyes turned toward her. After reviewing the evidence, including testimony from Ethan, Noah, and Miss Roberts, as well as the financial records and audio recordings presented, the court finds overwhelming evidence of neglect and financial fraud on the part of Carl and Linda Miller. A collective gasp rippled through the room. Carl's face turned red, his carefully constructed facade crumbling in real time. He opened his mouth as if to protest, but the judge raised a hand to silence him. "Mr. Miller," she continued, her voice firm, "you have not only failed in your duties as a foster parent but have also exploited the foster care system for personal gain. Your actions have caused significant harm to a child who trusted you for care and safety. The court cannot and will not overlook such egregious behavior." Carl shot to his feet, his voice shaking with anger. "This is ridiculous. This kid is lying. We've done nothing but care for him." "Sit down, Mr. Miller," the judge commanded, her tone icy. Carl hesitated, but eventually dropped back into his chair, his fists clenched. The judge turned her attention to Linda, who was sobbing quietly, clutching Carl's arm. "Mrs. Miller, your complicity in this matter is equally troubling. You enabled and participated in the neglect and financial misuse. While you may not have been the primary actor, your inaction and support of these actions make you equally responsible." Linda shook her head, her voice breaking. "Please, Your Honor, I didn't mean. I was just trying to help. I didn't know it would go this far." "Enough," the judge interrupted sharply. "This is not a discussion. The evidence speaks for itself." She turned her gaze back to Carl. "Effective immediately, Carl Miller, you are under arrest for child neglect and financial fraud. Bailiffs, please escort Mr. Miller into custody." Two bailiffs approached Carl, who looked as though he'd been struck. He stumbled backwards, shouting, "You can't do this. I have rights." But the bailiffs grabbed his arms and cuffed him, leading him toward the exit as Linda's sobs grew louder. "Linda Miller," the judge continued, "you will remain under investigation and are barred from fostering any children indefinitely. Your level of involvement will be determined in subsequent hearings." Linda collapsed into her chair, her cries echoing in the courtroom. Ethan watched it all unfold, his emotions a tangled mess. He felt relief. Yes, Carl and Linda could no longer hurt him, but he also felt a hollow ache, a reminder that once again he was losing a place he had tried, however unsuccessfully, to call home. As Carl was escorted out in handcuffs, Linda reached out toward Ethan, tears streaming down her face. "Ethan, please, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for it to be like this." Ethan flinched, unsure how to respond. Miss Roberts placed a hand on his shoulder and leaned in. "You don't have to say anything," she whispered. The judge brought her gavel down, regaining the courtroom's attention. "In light of these findings, Ethan will be reassigned to a new foster family. The Child Welfare Agency has been informed and will expedite the process to ensure his placement in a safe and supportive environment." Ethan exhaled shakily, relief mingling with uncertainty. He looked at Miss Roberts, who gave him a small, reassuring smile. "This isn't the end, Ethan," she said softly. "It's the beginning of something better." As the courtroom emptied, Ethan remained in his seat, his hands gripping the edge of the table. The relief of knowing Carl and Linda could no longer hurt him was undeniable, but it wasn't as comforting as he had hoped. A familiar weight sat heavy in his chest, the uncertainty of what came next. He stared down at his hands, feeling both free and adrift. Miss Roberts stayed beside him, watching him closely. "You did so well today, Ethan," she said, her voice soft but full of pride. "You were brave, and that's not easy. You should be proud of yourself." Ethan nodded but didn't look up. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice small. She hesitated for a moment. "Well," she began carefully, "normally you'd be placed with another foster family while everything gets sorted out." Ethan's shoulders sagged. "Another family," he murmured, almost to himself. He didn't need to say more. The weight of those words was clear. Miss Roberts leaned forward slightly, her tone growing quieter. "Ethan, I've been thinking about this a lot. You've been through so much more than any kid should ever have to face. And through it all, you've shown so much strength. But I don't think you should have to keep starting over." He finally looked up at her, confused but curious. "What do you mean?" She offered him a tentative smile, her words careful but sincere. "What I mean is, how would you like to live with me? You with you?" Ethan's eyes widened, his breath catching in his throat. Miss Roberts nodded, her smile softening. I know it's a big question, and I don't expect you to answer right away, but I've been thinking about it a lot, and I'd really like to give you the kind of home you deserve. A real one. Ethan's gaze dropped to the table, his heart pounding in his chest, a mix of disbelief and hope swirling inside him. You really mean it? He asked quietly. I wouldn't say it if I didn't, she said, her voice steady. I know I can't erase what you've been through, but I can make sure you don't have to go through it again. And I'd be lucky to have you as part of my family. Ethan felt tears well up in his eyes. For so long, he had convinced himself that no one really wanted him, that he was just another burden to be shuffled around. But Miss Roberts's words felt real different. I think I'd like that, he said, his voice trembling. Miss Roberts reached out, placing a hand gently over his. Then let's make it happen, she said softly, one step at a time. Ethan stood hesitantly in the doorway of Miss Roberts's home, his backpack hanging loosely off his shoulder. The house was warm and inviting, with soft yellow walls and shelves filled with books and framed family photos. The scent of fresh-baked cookies filled the air. He caught sight of a girl with shoulder-length blonde hair stepping into the hallway. She looked about his age and wore a bright blue sweater that seemed to match her cheerful expression. Hi there, you must be Ethan, she said, extending her hand confidently. I'm Grace, Miss Roberts's daughter. Ethan stared for a moment before slowly shaking her hand. Hi, he murmured. Grace smiled warmly. Mom's been talking about you nonstop. Oh, and she baked cookies, chocolate chip, her specialty. You're going to love them. Before Ethan could respond, a man with sandy brown hair and a friendly demeanor appeared, drying his hands on a dish towel. Welcome, Ethan, he said, offering his hand. I'm James, Grace's dad. Glad to have you here. Ethan glanced at Miss Roberts, unsure of how to react. She gave him an encouraging nod. Come on, she said gently. Let's show you your room. The room was small but cozy, with light green walls and a soft bed covered in a patchwork quilt. A desk by the window and a small, framed photo of Ethan from school sat on the desk. He stared at it, unsure how it had made its way here. I wanted it to feel like your space, Miss Roberts said softly, watching him. If there's anything you'd like to add, just let me know. It's nice, Ethan murmured, setting his backpack on the bed. Grace leaned against the doorway with an easy grin. Let me know if you need anything. Oh, and fair warning, Dad is way too competitive at board games, but I'm the reigning champion. From the hallway, James called out, she cheats. Don't trust her. Ethan let out a small laugh, surprising himself. I don't know how to play board games, he admitted. No worries, Grace said. We'll teach you. One evening after dinner, Miss Roberts joined him on the porch. The air was crisp, and the stars shone brightly overhead. How are you feeling, Ethan? She asked gently. It's different, he said after a pause, but it's not bad. Miss Roberts smiled. Different can be good. And remember, you're part of this family now. We're here for you, me, Grace, and James. You don't have to do this alone. Ethan nodded, his chest tightening with unfamiliar emotion. Thanks, he said quietly. Later that night, as he lay in bed, Ethan stared out the window at the stars. His chest felt lighter, freer. Whispering softly, he said, maybe this is what it feels like to be safe. The house was quiet, filled with warmth and hope, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan believed that maybe, just maybe, he'd found his place. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed this story, give this video a like. If you haven't already, subscribe for more.